Welcome to Branding the Beltway. I'm Stacey Piper, a 25-year government marketing expert and the host of the podcast that helps you level up your B2G marketing game with actionable insider tips and real-world case studies. If you're in the business of doing business with the government, you're in the right place. Each episode delivers straight-to-the-point strategies from senior marketing leaders familiar with navigating the unique world of GovCon. In each episode, we'll first explore that month's topic on a macro level, talking strategy with CXOs. Then we'll deep dive into the same topic on a micro level, examining the practical approach of development and implementation. We're talking brand awareness, content strategy, and the campaign tactics that actually move the needle. Whether you're a CXO, a growth strategist, or marketing practitioner looking to strengthen your federal position, Branding the Beltway is your essential resource for driving results and winning more contracts. Let's connect strategy to execution and position your brand to win. Welcome to this episode of Branding the Beltway. I'm your host, Stacey Piper, and today's guest is Brian Wagner from Tria Federal. Brian is the Vice President of Marketing and Communications at Tria Federal. Tria delivers digital services and technology solutions to help agency customers complete their critical missions and modernize their systems in service of supporting the health and safety of veterans, warfighters, and civilians. Welcome, Brian. Tell us a bit more about yourself.
Thanks for having me, Stacey. It's great to be here. So, as you mentioned, I am the head of marketing communications at Tria. I'm also, by way of not being busy enough, a Reserve Navy public affairs officer for over 16 years now. I enjoy working in marketing communications because it allows my generalist brain to run all over the place, helping enable and empower other folks in a wide variety of areas. Obviously, a lot of AI these days, but I'll dig deep on any topic. So I really enjoy the opportunity to be a marketing communications person, and specifically working in GovCon these days is very exciting and very fascinating.
That's great. I'm not sure I knew you were a PAO. That's really cool. We'll have to talk more about that later. So for our guests joining, we always examine a topic first from the strategic lens for our CXOs, and then we dive deep with some practical insights for the more operational level and marketers that are listening. And today we are talking about how GovCons can embrace the PESO framework. And I'll have Brian explain that acronym in just a minute. But really, this is going to be how companies and marketers can plan and execute an integrated communication strategy. So I know that PESO is a term we're familiar with as marketers, and it's probably widely used in the commercial space, but maybe not so much in GovCon. So can you, before we launch in, can you just explain that for us?
Sure. And I think the first thing to keep in mind is, even though it has a name and a branding, it's a way to think about communicating. It is not something where you need to talk about it in a buzzwordy form. We capture it in that way, but it's just to help think through the ways in which you coordinate and synchronize communications efforts. So PESO stands for paid, earned, shared, owned, which is kind of a shorthand way of summarizing the different elements of the communications activities and tools we have. I think the most important thing to keep in mind is really about coordination and orchestration of communications towards a goal, not an end-all be-all of itself. So PESO isn't just jargon; it's a framework for influence across the buyer journey. Paid builds awareness, earned builds credibility, shared builds trust, and owned builds authority in yourself. And these are all essential, of course, with GovCon having a long sales cycle. And also, just to kind of clarify what each of those means for folks who don't necessarily know what falls in each bucket. Paid would be LinkedIn advertising, a conference sponsorship. Earned would be media coverage in Washington Technology or Federal News Network, or a Wash 100 award, recognition. Shared is your employees and your partners, talking about you. It could be amplification through an industry group like ACT-IAC or AFCEA. And then owned is your own website, your own social media accounts, the things that you inherently control day in and day out.
I love that. That's really succinct. And those examples, I'm sure, will help everyone grasp what we're talking about. And I love that you mentioned it's really not a specific methodology. It's really a mnemonic to remember the four types. And so that's a good tip for everyone.
Yeah, and
So
it was put together, by I believe it was Gini Dietrich of Spin Sucks who originally put it together and kind of popularized it. The way I like how it was visualized, it's you have four bases and then all the different elements that fit into each kind of spinning out because some people don't have the same tools that other people have. So it starts from a basis that everybody can understand, but then you work with it based on how mature your organization is. If you're a Fortune 500 company, you can use every single tool that might possibly be aligned. If you're a, small GovCon, it's a very different space, especially if you're an army of one.
absolutely. No, that's a good point. And there's it's like a, I don't know, life cycle curve because, right, a lot of small GovCons are really just starting with owned because that's all they have. And you really don't have the authority to earn media until you're a bit more known and trusted. So it's all kind of a chicken and an egg and kind of iteratively building.
Yeah.
So that's a good reminder. Excellent. So this first half of the discussion, we're going to talk about how how leaders should be thinking about the PESO framework when they're drawing up their teams, creating goals for their SMEs and their teams, and also funding their various departments. So if you were talking to your executive leaders that are focused more on financial outcomes like pipeline and contract wins, or even compliance metrics, how do you position PESO?
So I think the first thing, even stepping back from PESO, is just the importance working in Marcom of being business minded. That's the reason I went back after 15 years in the workforce to get my MBA, was I recognized how much I was making decisions based on what sounded good as a communicator, not necessarily a deep understanding of business cycles or of executive decision making in what drives the existence and success of businesses. So I think, understanding that sets you up for success in the first place because you can understand and speak the language of business, and then everything else gets easier. For PESO, first of all, I would probably never use the acronym PESO except in passing. Because that's inside baseball for us, but not necessarily for the business leader who has much rather have you be talking about EBITDA or something like that with them. So but I position it as a brand builder and as a force multiplier for capture. It's a way to make every dollar, every message work across your channels, your audiences, your BD stages. I think it's about understanding what it is, but also where it fits in. And that's, I think, tied to that broader challenge doing Marcom of helping people understand how you can help win, how you can help position, and how some of the things that you do that might not be as directly connected can actually be essential over time. Such as the fact that, you are proactively and comprehensively shaping how an organization is viewed and perceived, which can have very strong trickle-down effects. I think ultimately it's PESO represents levers, that Marcom can pull. And so it works best when you are integrating it with business operations and being funded and supported in part by them in a conversation about which levers you might be able to pull to help them achieve business outcomes. And even if you're pulling those levers entirely on your own, say for, just your corporate brand building, that you're still educating people. That's not just, hey, look, our LinkedIn page has more followers, period. It is that our audience has grown and we're reaching people with these characteristics and our engagement rates are up, which means that they're consuming the content and actually learning from it, and having those elements of where is that going and what does that mean for us?
Wondering when we talk about go-to-market strategies in GovCon, how you are able to connect this model with the capture process or your ABM, account-based marketing strategies.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think that, it first of all requires maturity on both the marketing and the BD sides. there's certainly times in an organization's life cycle or just what's going on where it's kind of marketing has to act on its own and it doesn't have the advantage of coordination. So you're making judgment calls about how to position, in the absence of specificity, how to position the brand for resilience, for, relevance. Like, the way I described it in my first year here at Tria, which was only when I got here 10 months old as a public entity, was we needed to do the kitchen sink model, which was we just did everything to make people know us, like us, and understand us because we had so much ground to grow from and build from, having brought together different brand names and different companies. So it didn't matter as much at first because we had so much empty space to operate in. We just needed to fill that space. As you get more mature, I think PESO maps well with the capture process. It helps build awareness, credibility, engagement, validation. I think particularly it can really help with like pre-RFP positioning, where you have the greatest ability to influence buying decisions because folks on the government side are more open to conversations. They're kind of doing their broader research. They're not as locked down into their review and decision-making process. But I think it's a constant dialogue. So for example, I just had a call with our BD team yesterday, which will be a totally different date and time when this airs. But we had this conversation. We get together every month to say how can we leverage marketing resources to align against pipeline priorities in the short and long term. And we had both kind of very specific conversations about potential digital targeting to try to reach people with some specific messaging and landing pages based on a timeline of a few months. Very much like it's a quick move, but we can possibly get some, valid efforts. The longer term, though, was how do we work on the 12 to 24 month timeline? And our first step, frankly, was just talk about when are we going to set up meetings to intake the information we needed to understand how the BD team was operating, so that could filter into our process as we were going through that decision process around what are we doing in paid in the coming months? Where are we pitching on the earned? What are we sharing? And of course, the own piece, which is the foundation, how does that relate to the things we could say that could help us win more business? Ultimately, if you have a good ability to measure and you have good alignment, you're looking at better P-win, better, win probability, brand preference, increased executive visibility, all of those things I think are the outcomes. But again, I think it's start by speaking business language and understanding what keeps them up at night. And when you say I'm here to help, not I'm with the government, I'm here to help, which is the scariest phrase people always, react to. But I'm with marketing, I'm here to help. That's a lot more positively received than it's like, hey, I'm writing a press release. I need some data points from you. Because in this case, you're offering to give, not take, is how it's perceived, I think, a lot of times when folks on the business side are busy.
That's a good reminder because, like, even what you're saying about owned being the creator of authority, it even dovetails into like our thought leadership marketing programs that we run as, in GovCon, and, really making both our leadership team, but also our key staff that are client facing known to the audience so that when we submit those proposals, those key staff are recognizable and trusted.
Well, and you make a great point, which is, talking about the customer facing people. We're talking about PESO as kind of this online abstract, kind of words, oral, these things that we think of as the things we control. But it's also like, do you provide employees with attire that identifies their company so that when they are on site crossing paths, people are like, oh, it's the Tria team, it's Piper Strategies, not that's a contractor. Or I'm thinking about that guy who used to work for a different company, and I think that's where he's still at, but I don't know, and I don't really care because I'm busy. All of that matters because you want those folks to know when they see a message that it's relating to their people, the people they rely on, and they may not be aware of that. So they may read a great article and not realize that's their own contractor.
I love that. And it's so true. I'm sure you saw this firsthand since you've grown acquisitively over the years. But lots of times, if it's a takeaway or an acquisition, the client doesn't see any change in staff. It's the same people, they're just wearing different corporate colors. So it's
Yeah.
really important to brand the individuals as well.
It is. I was at the HIMSS conference in 2024, soon after starting, and I went to talk to one of our customers and just introduce myself and say hello. And they did not know who we were, even though like this was not abstract. These were actual people we supported. They didn't realize until I got into which companies were had fed into us. They had not learned about that connection or had not noticed that change, even though it had occurred a year earlier. So never take for granted, the long tail of old assumptions.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. Many business leaders and executives see earned and shared media as really soft metrics. And how do you make the case for those as growth drivers?
It's a great question. It's kind of a constant, it's kind of a constant struggle. And I think to some degree, there needs to be a level of not trying to justify it entirely, in the sense of not feeling so defensive that you have to try to force it to always mean something concrete. There's a reason why we do media, and why there's PR agencies everywhere in the world and so many PR people per journalist. It matters fundamentally in society to be able to tell your story. But I also would argue that a lot of this, if you have an intentional program, it's not a soft indicator. They're trust indicators, to a large degree, and they're relevance indicators. A quote in, Federal News Networks use, that example again, or, a subject matter expert post you put out that reaches, liked by an agency decision maker, those can carry a lot more weight than an ad. And yes, if you pay someone else, you're going to get back a lot more data because that's part of the model, is that they have much better reporting systems. And especially since many organizations in the GovCon world don't have in-house large data collection abilities, to show how their audience is working from a marketing standpoint, website traffic data. It's not nearly as mature as your B2B, B2C company, which is operating with a much larger audience base and a much larger prospective audience base. But I think it's about, again, understanding that the soft pieces play a role along with the parts that are more measurable. And yes, things that have charts and data points and show upward trends are great because that's how business operates. But a prestige piece, for example, in a publication that doesn't normally cover GovCon, is a validation not only of your company, but also of your ability to bring a narrative outside of your own localized echo chamber. A great example is, look at defense technology companies whose valuations have soared. Defense technology used to be something you invested in if you were a patriot, because the returns were not as good. And now returns can be up as much as 50 multiples in these companies. Yes, there's the demand, but it's also they've invested a lot of time and effort in telling their stories in ways that makes connections with what the threat is, what the need is, what the old past that needs to be discarded is. And, a lot of that is coming from simply spending time having clear messaging and repeating it in a wide variety of venues. And yes, they're measuring, but they're also spending their time coming up with really good narratives, and narratives and stories are a big part of how we understand the world. So you can also, again, tie it to more granular elements, but I think it's about helping people understand why brand, why narrative, why these things matter. And it's not just the external, it's also like, what do your employees believe in? If you have a strong narrative and a strong story and they're seeing outside validation, or they're seeing their colleagues sharing information, that helps reinforce the I work here because part of it as well.
That's true. And I feel like this is the second time it's come up that like what we practice with the target audience of prospects and buyers can also be applied within the own company, of building that narrative for how you speak to your executives about the results of your campaigns and activities. I know that in my world, sometimes quantitative feedback from their peers and the market is more valuable than any digital marketing metric I can offer. So I think that the quantitative, like you said, even though it makes pretty dashboards and charts, it may not be the most, sticky thing that they can really relate to, versus when a partner or a customer says, oh, I saw that piece, or I saw that post or that podcast or whatever, and I thought X, Y, and Z.
Absolutely. No, it's I think my favorite anecdote I've heard on the kind of qualitative side was one of our executives ran into a federal bureaucrat who they had known from a previous life at a larger company, one of the large companies, I should say, and had said, "Oh, I'm here now. You may not heard about us. We're relatively new and we're smaller." And the response from the federal bureaucrat was, "Oh, no, no, no. I follow you guys. I love seeing what you're doing. I read everything." I'm like, I don't know how many of that person there is. I can't quantify it, but the qualitative of this federal person who we have not in any way targeted specifically, just naturally finding what we're doing interesting. I mean, that made me very happy. And it also is a narrative element that has a lot more value than, one good data point, because it connects to that's one of the kind of people we want to reach. That's like the equivalent of doing a door-to-door polling and having somebody go, "I'm voting for your candidate." You love when that happens, even if you don't know what the overall numbers are.
Absolutely. I love that. That's the best case scenario that you can envision. So we were talking earlier about, the alignment with business development and how you just had that meeting with your BD team. And I know from working with BD teams, right, that there are things happening in their world. Like they're getting feedback from the front line because they're interacting with customers, and they're working on influence maps as part of capture teams, and they know who the targets are and what they're hearing and thinking and feeling. And they're even working on solutions and win themes to put in proposals. So what are some ways that leaders can ensure that the PESO related marketing efforts actually align with the other delivery teams that may be operating in silos?
It's a great question. And I think proposals are a really fun one because, and I mean fun in the not fun sense, because it's often such a scramble struggle to pull together all of the inputs into proposals that critiquing the messaging and seeing if it aligns with the corporate external messaging is often something that gets kind of abandoned. I think you have to start with shared goals and language, aligning what Marcom's doing, what the PESO campaigns are to the capture plan priorities and pursuit milestones. And I think that's the important thing there is you have to meet and you have to have dialogue that is not time bound in a sense of urgency. You need to have that long view where you're kind of searching through their efforts to figure out which parts are relevant to Marcom, which parts are not. Because there are certainly pursuits where there's no influence to be had. It's, the lowest price technically, available is the only thing that matters. Or it's a recompete where the customer is tired of hearing about us because they've been working with us for years and don't need to know anything else. But for the other elements, that's where I think, having that sense of what are you working towards? Here's what we're doing. How can we find that? And then meeting regularly to have those conversations is important. I think you also want to look at how do you embed in the BD rhythms, particularly, pipeline review, color team inputs. One thing that I've done at multiple businesses now is get Marcom added into the color team planning documents. So it identifies at which stage are they supposed to ask, do we need Marcom to be involved now? And not too soon. We understand there's a ton of research, ton of planning that is way too premature to the kind of thinking we do about execution. But I think that's really important to be pulled in that process as early as relevant and that it's reminded. And then also I think just having a kind of maybe a content to contract mindset where you're thinking about how do these various PESO touch points support the business objectives, leading to hopefully a contract win-in celebration. And I just want to point out celebration is actually really important too, because I've seen before where a company wins an award that's a surprise, like the market's surprised. And that's when the challenges come out, particularly when people don't think that that company should have won. They're more likely, I think, to step up and challenge. I think that's why it's important, not just in the lead up, but afterwards, to have that messaging out there and that effort to show why you won, not just to celebrate the win as a fact.
That's a really good point. Because a lot of times, whatever solution you've developed or whatever past performance you have that hasn't hit the street yet, because that other project hasn't been finalized and made public, it is about kind of building the reputation to be credible to do that work, so that you don't get challenged. I have a question that we didn't really talk about discussing, but you've kind of vacillated between talking about specific campaigns, like for a specific opportunity, versus the integrated corporate Marcom strategy. And are you looking at applying PESO in each individual campaign, or is it more of a over the whole portfolio?
I mean, both, really. First, I mean, I think that it starts at the corporate level because that's where, first of all, it's where Marcom sits in an organization our size. We don't have business unit Marcom teams. So we starting there, and also we want to make sure we're driving the corporate narrative, corporate SMEs, corporate priorities, looking at for like the weaknesses, where are we not particularly known, and it may be relevant to a specific pursuit, but it's also a broader challenge that we're going to fill in regardless of what is in the pipeline, because we know that we care about X agencies, but that substance is not part of the PESO elements. So I think at that corporate level, it helps the BD, it helps the specific campaigns, but it may not be directly aligned. And that's then where the follow-up is, and you don't do this on everything. At a previous company I was at, we had it was a larger, company. We had a $500 million target. Where pipeline deals at $500 million or above were what we would have these conversations in. Obviously, at a mid-market, we're more flexible. And also sometimes the rules go out the window because it's a prestige kind of win where you want to win to kind of open the door or be able to say you do it. But that's a follow-on conversation where you take into account what you might already do. But you also do it the opposite way. You say, if what you need specifically is X, Y, and Z, that actually is very relevant to what we're doing at the corporate level, but we didn't know. So now let's go back and build that into the higher level, because PESO is a day-by-day 365, element and on one side, but it's also episodic, as you note. So I think it's that balancing act, and I think it's important to kind of have your ear to the ground in a sense, both externally and internally, about whether the efforts and that balance you have between the two is appropriate. If everyone knows your company, but your win rate is lower than you want it to be, maybe you need to be more episodic and more targeted. Whereas if you're winning on your merits, but nobody really knows you, and you're maybe not in a position to step up to the next level or claim a mantle of some ability that nobody knows you have, then maybe it's the reverse. So I think that's I think a good point you raised, which is PESO is not static, and it's also it doesn't have defined boundaries in how you're pursuing it. Again, it's a model to apply in a way of thinking, but that's where ultimately you go back to, what does the business need? Does the brand need reinforcement, or is the pipeline need juicing? Where is the prioritization and the balance?
I like that. It kind of makes it feel like you can be like a mixologist with these levers, and like if something is falling in one area, you can like turn it up and de-emphasize some of the other areas until you get balance again.
I did go to bartending school, so I like that.
Good. I like that. So if you could give one piece of advice to executives who want to empower their marketing teams to drive more value using the PESO framework, what would it be?
I think it starts with marketing is not a service desk. I think that is a fundamental challenge, not just tied to PESO, but if you view and you empower marketing as a growth enabler, I think it's better, first of all, because you're welcoming marketing into the fold of decision-making on kind of a more equal basis. But it also then says that whatever is going to be done along that PESO element is going to be valued and hopefully understood and briefed at a more constant and authoritative level. So I think, and also if you empower marketing, you're going to put more time and effort into giving marketing visibility into capture and delivery priorities and spend more time explaining, the problems and the needs, because you understand that they can help you. They're not just waiting, and by they, I mean we're not just waiting for an order. Put out a press release. That is fine. Press releases are useful, but if that's kind of your viewpoint of how it works, you are missing so much. And I think coming with that is the autonomy to, not point, shoot a bunch of guided missiles, but much more that sense of here's what we're trying to achieve. And then let's check back in regularly to see how well it's going and course correct, as we need to. As I said, I've been in the Navy Reserve for 16 years. One thing about the Navy, because of operating at sea at distance, especially historically, is you could not give a daily command to someone in the Navy. A ship captain had ultimate authority, which is why we get these, mutiny and the bounty kind of stories of, of rebellion, which hopefully don't see in GovCon companies. But it's even with communication changes, you have to give, because of the nature of what they're doing, where they are, you have to give them room. And I think that same principle applies to marketing, is give a marketing team room to learn, to make mistakes, but to operate just like you would a growth team, which goes out and might not have any results for a year because of how they're working to try to lay the groundwork for success. I think it's having that same level of trust and empowerment. And then lastly, I'd say I think it's also useful to try to figure out what a shared scorecard or measurements look like. Again, measurement can be challenging, but figuring out, like, if there is a marketing CRM, for example, and a more sales BD CRM elements, because they're not always the same. I know we are working to bring those together. Figuring out, though, how you're measuring the people you're touching with, like your marketing content, your blogs, landing pages, and then the people you're actually meeting with, and making sure you're finding ways to bring those together. Or if you're talking about social media, trying to connect the data of the social media to the broader concerns of the company, and making that effort to say, where does marketing data fit into our reporting scheme, into the things we measure and report to board members, to owners, wherever it goes.
I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, I think the alignment with business development, seat at the table, empowerment, test and learn culture, all of that, it just moves marketing from a cost center service bureau model to more of a growth driver. Brian, thank you so much. We're going to take a quick break and we'll come back and examine the same topic from a practical, tactical level. This episode of Branding the Beltway is brought to you by Piper Strategies and Orange Slices. Piper Strategies, marketing that moves the needle. Piper Strategies is a full-service creative agency for leaders serious about growth. We decode the complex, translating mission-driven work into clear, compelling narratives. Our clients expand their reach, communicate with impact, and earn trust in competitive markets so they can win more work. We don't just deliver results, we build your internal marketing muscle. With Piper Strategies, clients grow with us until they outgrow us. It's a partnership-first, un-agency approach that not only gets you noticed and builds credibility, but also scales your brand and your team. Learn more at piperstrategies.com. Orange Slices, fresh intelligence for B2G success. Cut through the noise with Orange Slices, a trusted source for public sector insights, teaming opportunities, and procurement intel. With a playful name and a powerful platform, they're serious about making data accessible and usable so the entire GovCon community can thrive. For resources, visit orangeslices.ai. Welcome back to Branding the Beltway. We are on with Brian Wagner from Tria Federal discussing the PESO model. Brian, now we're talking across to your peers and other companies and helping them also talk downward to their teams to implement the PESO model. So for smaller GovCons or lean teams, what is a manageable way to start implementing this framework without a big budget or agency support?
Do everything yourself. That's obviously the answer, is just, put all the weight on your no. I think you really want to begin. I think you mentioned this at the beginning. Beginning starting with a kind of an owned and shared foundation. Obviously, most people have a website. They have some social media. They have coworkers. They might belong to a few advocacy groups and associations. That's the kind of foundation to start with. That lets you execute some consistent thought leadership, which requires you to have thoughts. It's always mind-boggling to me, having come from public relations agencies, where you get op-eds where people didn't actually end up saying anything. So I always, that's always the big challenge. You've got to understand what you have to say, and you have to be willing to clarify and narrow it to a point where it actually stands out. But there's that. I mean, I think social media is really important, especially LinkedIn. With everything going on in social media, LinkedIn has picked up an outsized importance, taking journalists away from Twitter/X, and really taking lessons from elsewhere. So we focus almost all our efforts on LinkedIn, for example, to build audience and build community. And then doing a cadence of storytelling around the customers. Any size company should be able to figure out, where can we get approval to do case studies? Where have we helped people in a way that speaks to where we want to go? Because if you don't put that out there, no one's going to know, especially when you're smaller. At that point, though, that's kind of the baseline. But you also can kind of layer in earned without much more effort. Again, GovCon coverage is a relatively narrow field, so it kind of depends on what you do and if you have something specific that speaks to, say, cybersecurity publications in addition. But it's always worth, you should always tell people when good news occurs, when you hire new people, even if they don't respond. There's definitely publications who've covered us once, who I've emailed 70 different times, because I want them to have the information available if they decide it's worthwhile. Awards also is something I kind of put under earned, put your employees up for things. And then paid, yeah, when you're small and you don't have a lot of money, it sounds daunting, but you can run a legitimate social media campaign for $5,000 if it really matters, or do geofencing, on digital advertising of an event space. There's a lot of things you can do with small dollars these days because of the nimbleness of that structure, especially if you have a very clear sense of who you're trying to reach. And then lastly, I'd say, don't just do this piecemeal. Come up with some sort of simple, content calendar that tracks the ideas you have, and then the things that people within your company tell you are worth promoting, talking about, whether it be a business development milestone, a contract timeline, or in absence of news, who are the really amazing employees you have? I mean, that's something we launched last year, was the People of Tria, which is a profile series. We did a bunch on our website, and then when that got kind of filled up, we just started doing in-depth LinkedIn profiles. And I mean, it's great to be able to call attention, because we're able to talk about some of the customers we support, the types of people we have, and it supports retention, it supports recruiting, supports brand, and we control it entirely. We don't have to ask anyone else for permission.
Yeah, that's great. I love having people content in the stream. I think for firms like us, like we're service providers, it's often the people that make the difference in what we deliver to the client, but also in how they experience our brand. So highlighting them is excellent. And you're right about the budgets. I mean, especially targeted digital can be so lean right now. One little hack that worked for me, I don't know if you've tried it before, but when you tie a deal specifically to the pipeline or one specific effort, all of those opportunities usually have a BMP code. And there's a certain amount of money that the company has set aside for overhead to help position for that pursuit. And if you tie a marketing campaign into that pursuit to help stand out, then you can often get funded through that PMP budget.
We were just in that BD meeting, we were just discussing that, and I've done that at other companies as well. It's always one of the questions I ask, which is, here's all the things we could do that align to PESO, and how much money do you have? Because if you don't have any money, then we're going to probably lean on owned and maybe earned. But if you have money, sky's the limit. Well,
Absolutely.
maybe not the limit, but sky's the budget.
There you go. So for these in-house marketing teams, what tips would you give them to prioritize amongst the different PESO elements when resources, or like whether it's time or people, is limited?
So, it's a great question because the PESO model doesn't have a linear direction. It's not like PESO, loop it around. I mean, that's just, it could have been the SIPO model for all it, really matters. I think in the end, you want to prioritize where you have the greatest credibility or reach and the lowest cost of entry. How do you balance that out? Owned, you should always be starting with owned, because your websites and your social media are your front doors. And they're also the place where you authoritatively can explain, can contextualize. Doesn't mean that that's what somebody's going to find. They may Google and get led to some industry thing that says opposite, but at least you want to make that effort always to start out. And then from there, again, it varies. Is the problem that you have money, you just don't have time? Then probably paid. Do you not have very many employees or very many relationships? Then shared is probably hard. So I think it's understanding that and also understanding who you're trying to reach. And are they, like, if nobody traffics to your website, you can't just put content on your website. You've got to get the content to people in some form. So again, that's the idea of getting yourself out of the head of the creator and thinking about who is the audience and how do I get to them? What are the channels and how do I also know if I've done that? I know, we haven't talked about AI yet, which I mentioned at the beginning, but I mean, AI is everywhere. Repurposing through AI is, I think, a really big thing these days. Write a white paper, then use an AI tool, whether it be ChatGPT or something more specialized, to turn it into a blog post or multiple, turn it into social media posts, turn it into a script for a video. That used to be something that you manually did, and you might not do it if you don't have time. That's not an excuse anymore, especially if you are paying attention to setting the tool up in a way that's pulling from the resources you're giving it so it doesn't do hallucinations. Business objectives, as I mentioned, like what are you actually trying to achieve? If you don't have clarity, then probably building an audience is a good starting point. But if you know what you're trying to achieve, reach certain people, you have to think about how does that influence it. I can write 10 blogs, but if our entire business is based on winning a major key deal, I should really be orienting on how am I reaching that person and then what feeds into that piece. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the kitchen sink. Sometimes you just do what you can and you see what works and you just try everything, see where you have a natural fit, see what's easy, see what's fun, because it should be fun. Like, if I think communications and marketing is an amazing field to work in because you get to do so much and you get to talk to really interesting people and you get to say, look how awesome we are. But the joy you take in the specific pieces of work shows through. So if you're a one of one and you personally like something else, do that first. Like, get in your own groove and then grow from there. Because if you're a communicator, not a marketer, you're not going to be good at marketing right away until you have a chance to build up a group of content, build from it. So it's variable, but I think the main thing is have a dialogue about what are you trying to achieve and how are you going to get there.
I like that. And I like that you can achieve different things with different strategies and tactics. And I really love, of course, doing what you love, because I also think marketing communications is super fun. And the content we put out, it should be fun and engaging for the recipient too, and useful for them, right? And I think that's one of the, I don't know, challenges, if you will, sometimes with owned, is sometimes customers are so, or companies are so focused on what they do and how their solution's different, that they just talk about themselves and not what that tool can be used for or what the upside is for the customer. And so really, building that utility content so that it's actually useful to the recipient and engaging with them is good. And I'm glad you brought up AI. It's obviously a huge help for repurposing content, let's say. Are there any other tips or even traps with marketing and AI that you want to talk about?
I mean, absolutely. I could talk about AI stuff all day long these days. I think one of the first areas that is really important is to understand how AI is changing what we originally saw as SEO. So, SEO and now it's either called AEO or GEO for either artificial. I don't even remember the acronym. We have not yet figured out which acronym we're sticking with yet. So, GEO would be generative engine optimization. We'll still stick with that. That is one that's been interesting to me because, again, we do a lot of organic content, in part because just one thing I should mention is, PESO is driven in part by the people in your team, what they can do. If you got great writers, you're going to put out a lot of great written content. And we do have great writers. So that's been part of what we do. And, GEO, it's looking at authoritative insights and thought leadership more so than SEO, which you always are looking at what are the keywords in the back end, the tags and stuff. And that still matters, obviously. But when you say go into ChatGPT and ask a question and it's pulling sources, it's pulling based on, where the main sources of knowledge in the internet are, but it's also pulling on where the precise levels of knowledge. So if you're doing blog posts in terms of answering common questions, things that make it easy for, a generative search engine to pull out information and say like, oh, they've answered this question. And it's done in an authoritative way with external citations, we'll use this as a potential source. So I think that's something to keep in mind is when you're creating content, write it in a way that if somebody is coming to collect knowledge for the internet and to make answers, you're putting things out there to be found, especially if you have very specific expertise in certain areas. Obviously we don't really know consistently how people in the federal government use it right now. Some people are really far ahead, some are very far behind, but you got to future-proof in a sense. It also accelerates your ability to identify what you should and should not be doing in terms of like content intelligence. There's tools out there now that you can be like, I want to write on this topic, and it will scour the internet and come back and say, these are the ways in which you can write about that topic and have the greatest likelihood of succeeding based on what's succeeding on the internet right now. Personalization at scale, the idea of modifying content or even web pages. I had an interesting conversation with a colleague at another company. They're exploring how could they even in the future build a web page that doesn't have a defined shape, where when you visit based on your interest, the web page would reform itself essentially to provide you with information based on your interests, not in a way that's a scroll linear model. So there's a lot of stuff to be done there, and also just frankly, strategic planning, ideation is really helpful. So there's a lot of interesting ways there. I will give one example of just the challenges with this. It's very easy to lose sight of that you still have to get through the day and get things done when you start playing with different AI tools. You're like, you might say, let's do AI video. And by say you might, I mean, we have exactly done this where we did a video in a traditional model, stock footage, voiceover recording, demo from a software thing. So we had a fully written out script. So afterwards, I gave my creative lead the script and said, go play with some of the leading AI video tools. So I think we should really move in that direction. Try your Soras, try your Midjourney. And he played around, came back, and he said, this is not really working out great. Not like it's not going to work, but he said, here's some examples. And the best looking example had somebody at computer typing, somebody in military uniform standing next to them. I'm like, this isn't bad. Then the military guy walks through the desk. Doesn't exist anymore. Or ships on the ocean and airplanes flying over. I'm like, great. Then I noticed that the airplanes aren't moving in a video. So we've seen some other successes we continue to test in other ways. But I think it's that balancing act of you have to keep doing the production, the thinking, the ideation, even as you're exploring the new AI tools. And you also have to understand that if you really like certain tools, we're in an early phase where people, much like Uber back in the day, want you to adopt. So they're going to keep the prices low. So you have to understand that the things you get addicted to might become very expensive over time once they get vendor lock-in. So it's that balance of, in the Marcom world of never getting too in love with certain tools that you lose sight of the ability to get the job done if you don't have that tool or if it becomes too expensive.
That's a good reminder and a good cautionary tale. I mean, I love AI and I'm using it every day, but I too have struggled with the visuals and videos. But just knowing and informing your team and your key stakeholders that no matter the AI tool, it's only as good as the marketer using it. And if you can't have non-marketers creating marketing campaigns and content using AI if they don't understand the business, the solution, the target audience, and marketing.
Yeah, and I think there was a great article, I think it was in the Harvard Business Review, which I feel like by quoting the Harvard Business Review, it's like there's certain strata of things you quote that just make you a silly person, like, oh, in The Economist, the Harvard Business Review. But it had a great article about the way that especially leaders should use AI is use it as a decider. Like you come to it from the mindset of I need to make decisions, help me, versus I'm just going to open it and explore, because the problem is it will take you wherever it thinks you want to go. And if you don't know where you want to go, you're not going to get there. And it's the same thing on, like, say, AI for creative. If you're not a creative person who can describe your vision, you're not going to get great output. So I think that's understanding what you're able personally to do with it, or your members of your team are able to do with it based on the skills they already have, is an important element as well.
Yes, I agree. So before we close, for the practitioners listening, what is the first small step they can take tomorrow or next week or next month to start operationalizing the PESO model in their org?
It's a great question. I think first of all is understanding where you fit. Like, audit your communications, like the tools you have and what you're doing through a PESO lens, and try to understand like where you're over-indexed, where you don't have capacity. Like, understand where you're coming from, like what's in your toolkit, so you understand how you can execute against kind of a PESO model. And understand the way that PESO isn't about I'll do a little bit of this, I'll do a little bit of that. It's about how did the pieces work together to achieve your goals. I think a great way to start is create a PESO plan for a specific campaign or objective where it's measurable. You can hold it, kind of put your arms around it, understand it, the audience with clarity. So it gives you a sense of test it where all the variables are known. I think then experimenting, like saying, well, we're really weak in paid, but I'm going to set aside some money and I'm going to spend some time figuring out how to do LinkedIn ad buying, even if I've never done it, so I can figure out, where we go in that direction, because I think that's valuable for the future. And, having those experimental steps along the way. Ultimately, if you understand the levers you have to pull in those areas, you're not accountable, especially in smaller teams. Nobody expects you to be able to do or have everything. So it's a matter of shaping the way in which you then talk to those business leaders, wrapping it back to the leadership, knowing the ways in which you say, this is what we can do, this is what we can achieve, these are the levers we have, and be able to identify these are the areas, kind of defending your turf. This is where I could grow or more I could do if I was given more resources, more time, whatever it is. But I think it's just starting with that understanding of what PESO is in the real world, not just the abstract, and where it can help or where it charts a course for you for the future.
Yeah, that's good advice. And I think the audit, I really like kind of looking inward first before you ask for anything and see where your gaps are. Or look at the purpose of each of those levers and see where the brand is weak, and kind of diving deep into the places where you're weak or you have gaps. So
absolutely.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time, Brian. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm sure that our listeners will get some good nuggets here.
I enjoyed the invitation. I love that you're doing this series, Stacey. So thanks so much.
Absolutely. Take care. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Branding the Beltway. If you're looking for an outsourced marketing partner or fractional marketing leadership who truly gets the GovCon sector, Piper Strategies is the team to know. We're not just here to deliver, we're here to empower. For resources or to inquire, visit piperstrategies.com.